Today's occurrence happens in an underwater sinkhole in South Africa in what is believed to be the biggest in the world. Now, this place has drawn in explorers and divers for decades because it's surrounded in mystery, beauty, and a decent dose of danger and fear. For some divers, the danger is what calls them. Well, that and the idea of successfully conquering its deepest points, even while being fully aware of the risks. For two of those divers, their trip into the sinkhole went completely off script, and even though the two incidents happened over a decade apart, their stories are forever tied together. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of a few divers in Bushman's Cave. David Shaw, who goes by Dave, was an Australian scuba diver and airline pilot. He was born July 20th, 1954, and in 1973 became a crop duster pilot, which is an insanely dangerous job. They're the guys you see in small planes flying literally 9 to 10 feet off the ground, spraying seeds, fertilizers, or chemicals onto crops. I don't know the Australian stats, but according to an article based on an older study and the rabbit hole I fell down on the topic, about 12 crop dusters die in crashes every year, making up roughly 10% of all deaths in the aviation industry. And that's out of the 5,000 people even qualified to do the job. It's very hard to break into the field, even with experience being an airline or fighter jet pilot. It's just a different beast, and you can't fly on instinct. So farms like to stick to the established near retirement aged guys because even at that point, the job still requires their full concentration, like not even a podcast in the background, like you can do when you're doing literally almost anything else. Now, that's how Dave started out. The same year he started crop dusting, he met a woman named Anne, and they got married the following year. In 1981, they moved to Papua New Guinea, where Anne became pregnant with their first child. During the pregnancy, Dave said God wanted him to fly with Missionary Aviation Fellowship. So he transitioned to be a missionary pilot where he would fly in and out of remote mountain airfields. Dave and Ann both grew up very religious, with there being people in pastoral positions in churches on both sides of their family. Dave and Ann went on to have another child together and moved around a bit more. Dave took more pilot courses and applied for an international airline, Cathay Pacific. It was based in Hong Kong, so that's where they moved to in 1989. And worked at a high school there. In 1996, Dave's son started learning to dive, and about 3 years later, Dave decided he wanted to learn too. He pretty much fell in love with technical diving. It's what he wanted to do, so much so that he felt his day job didn't give him enough time to dive. He got 6 weeks of leave a year, and he would split that time in half with his family and the other half with diving. But since his job had him traveling so much, he was able to dive all over the world whenever his schedule allowed it. Now, Bushman's Hole, which is called Bozeman's Gat locally, is on the privately owned Mount Carmel Game Farm on 11,000 acres of land. There, you'll find a small basin of water about the size of a swimming pool that goes down as a narrow, winding chimney before opening up into a huge chamber after 150 feet. Picture an upside-down funnel with a curve in the stem. And this isn't the average dive site because it's very deep at 928 feet or 283 meters. It's a challenging dive even for experienced divers, with more people having been on the International Space Station than have dived to that depth, especially in that cave. Now, in the past, most divers had used an open circuit system to dive that deep. There hadn't been too many people diving that deep, period, but those that did were on open circuit, which is the gear you probably usually see divers using with an air tank or two. Divers breathe in through it, and when they breathe out, the air is released into the water, creating bubbles. Open circuits typically use more air since every exhale is released into the environment. Now, a rebreather is a closed circuit system, which I've talked about previously, but similar to open circuit, it's how you breathe in the air from your air tanks. But instead of the air you exhale being released into the environment and making bubbles the entire time, it recirculates through the system. It passes through a filter that scrubs the carbon dioxide and sends the oxygen to an oxygen cylinder where it's mixed and balanced for the diver to use again. Since the air is being reused or rebreathed, fewer tanks are needed for longer dives. An added bonus to them is that the gas divers breathe in is warmer, which can help combat hypothermia in deeper water that's usually cold. And the further you go, the darker it is, so divers need to be able to navigate very dark conditions, even while having multiple light sources on them. So they're cold, it's dark, and even though they may have rebreathers, they are still under a time constraint, considering how deep the dive is. The deeper you go, the longer the dive, because you have to add in more decompression stops and longer decompression time. Decompression stops are necessary because as divers go deeper, stay under longer, or dive more frequently, their bodies absorb extra nitrogen. If they come up too quickly, that nitrogen can form dangerous bubbles in the body, which causes the bends or decompression sickness. Decompression stops on the way up lets their body release the nitrogen in stages, helping prevent those bubbles from forming. Symptoms from decompression sickness can range anywhere from feeling a little lightheaded or dizzy or a few aching joints, all the way to dying. Now, during his international flights as a pilot, Dave would sometimes dive at locations he had stops in. In 2002, Dave visited an old flooded asbestos mine turned dive site. He met Don Shirley, a diver with over 20 years of experience and known to be a great technical diver and instructor. Don was the owner of the dive site in Kamati Springs, South Africa. He was also a former British soldier, and they eventually became friends that dove together. Don took a rebreather course and purchased an Inspiration brand rebreather in April of 2003, just 2 years after they were first introduced to the public. For the next 7 months, Dave took 11 trips to South Africa to dive. He would do repetitive deep dives before piloting a plane full of passengers home. In October, Dave visited Kamati Springs again. His goal this time was to prepare for a more complex and deeper dive down the line. He was still pretty new to this kind of diving at this point, but he was eager to progress quickly. On a Saturday, he planned to go to about 230 feet or 70 meters down and set up bailout tanks for deeper dives he was planning to take later in the week. Don was busy working, but Dave found another diver who was looking for a buddy, so they chose to dive together. The guy was 57-year-old Lo, and he was pretty experienced but unfamiliar with that level in the cave that Dave wanted to dive to. Remember, the cave is an old mine, so it has equipment and other man-made objects and structures inside of it. But the pair made a plan on where Dave wanted the tanks dropped, how deep they would go, and when they would turn around. The dive went fine, but apparently Lo was having too much fun and was reluctant to turn around, as previously agreed, but eventually he did turn around and led the way back out. The next day, Don was still busy with students, but filled the tanks Dave needed to continue placing in the cave. Dave made it a point to mention that he had a hard time getting enough tanks and regulators. He was having issues with a few of his, and Dave didn't have the parts needed to fix the problem. So Dave sent his driver to pick up some spares somewhere else, and it worked out fine because the gases were eventually mixed the way Dave needed them. Depending on the dive goal and depth, air tanks require different mixtures of the gas inside of them. Since Dave was planning to dive for depth, he needed to have the different tanks that he was placing at different depths levels have various oxygen, helium, and nitrogen percentages in them. Lo wanted to join this dive too. Dave preferred to do more serious dives alone. He was going to about 394 feet this time. But Lo seemed to be a capable diver, so Dave let him come along. They agreed that Dave would start his dive alone, and 10 minutes after he left, Lo could follow him. They would meet at the bottom of the shaft when Dave was on his way back up after dropping a tank at 394 feet. They did the dive in the afternoon, and it went as planned. Dave put tanks where he needed to and made his way back. When he got to the agreed meeting point, Dave had to wait a minute or so for Lo to get there. It was a little funny to Dave because while he sat there waiting, he could see the time he would have to spend decompressing starting to increase on his dive computer. The shaft in Kamati Springs starts at 52 feet and goes all the way down to their meeting point. By the time Lo reached him, he was ready to go. He knew the guy wanted to look around, but Dave wanted to ascend, and they didn't agree to let Lo sightsee. So Dave acknowledged him and then signaled it was time to go. The next day, Dave did a shorter 80-minute dive where he put down another tank and relocated another. He called that one a rest day. On Tuesday, he was ready to do the big dive he had been preparing for the past few days. He was in the water by 9:30 a.m. and in good spirits. He had a small tank for argon that he would use to inflate his dry suit. It helps with keeping him warm, but it also helps to fight the increasing pressure he feels when descending that can cause his dive suit to painfully squeeze. Along with that small tank, he had 2 tanks that were bottom mix, so he couldn't use them to breathe until he was at least 98 feet or 30 meters deep. If you breathe that air in above that depth or on land, you will experience hypoxia in a way that will be significantly less than okay. Now, those 2 tanks specifically he had were actually mixed to be used from 394 to 595 feet, or 180 meters. But he had them for a different reason. I'll get to that in a moment. Dave was also diving with his rebreather and had 2 additional bailout tanks on him in case the rebreather failed. About 7 minutes into the dive, he made it into the narrow doorway that led to the top of the shaft that goes down to where he met low 2 days before. He had to remove one of his tanks to fit through the doorway, and once he got through the shaft, he exhaled and emptied his buoyancy vest of all the air so he could descend quickly. As the depth increased, so did his rate of descent, at which point he inhaled again and injected the argon into his suit to stop it from painfully squeezing him. He was keeping watch on his oxygen levels in his rebreather to make sure that it wouldn't get too high with his increasing depth. Dave would regularly inject one of his bottom mixes to act as a diluent, and it usually kept his oxygen levels low enough. As he approached the bottom of the shaft, he injected gas into his buoyancy vest to slow down just a little. He still wanted to keep his descent rate high until he reached the bottom. Once he made it to the bottom, he continued along the permanent guideline and continued adjusting the gas he was injecting into his suit and buoyancy vest. He turned left down an angled tunnel, and once he started going down the incline, the depth increased quickly, to the point where each breath he took required him injecting extra diluent into his breathing loop to counter the compression, and he had to do the same with injecting argon into his suit too. Pretty quickly, he passed the deepest tank he left a couple of days before and got to the end of the guideline that he left at 948 feet or 152 meters, a few weeks prior. Dave tied another line onto that point and continued descending down. He ran into a tight area that he had to squeeze through, but kept descending down. Now, before he started the dive, Dave planned to turn around when the first of 4 things happened. When he reached 597 feet, or 182 meters, when he had been diving for 30 minutes, when his dive computer told him that the time to reach the surface would be 350 minutes, which is 5 hours and 50 minutes, or lastly, when he felt lonely and wanted out. And here is where Dave realizes that he has hit 597 feet deep, and it has only been 21 minutes. In his words, he had really been monitoring what he was doing. He was busy reeling out, injecting gas into his suit, monitoring his depth and time. He was in a high state of concentration. He tied off the line and cut the reel before starting his ascent back to the surface. And his dive computer said his time to surface was 330 minutes. Dave managed to lay 279 feet of new line in under 30 minutes. But he knew he couldn't ascend as quickly as he went down into the cave, and he had to keep his rate to about 30 feet per minute. He went through his decompression stops on the way back up, and during one of his stops at the bottom of the shaft, he ran into Deon. Deon was acting as Dave's safety diver and started following him about 15 minutes after Dave left. According to Dave, Deon came down to see if he was okay. Dave had left a tank at the bottom of the shaft and planned to use it to flush his loop, which is how divers temporarily restore the gas mix to a specific amount of oxygen. They're basically flushing out the old mixture and replacing it with fresh gas with a specific oxygen level. It's safe if the diluent is safe to breathe at the depth they're in, and there's a bit more to it than that, but that's the gist. He was also trying to shave some of his decompression time. So Dave went to do that and realized the specific fitting he had on the tank wouldn't clip onto his rebreather the right way. He ditched the tank and stopped what he was trying to do because the diluent in his rebreather tank ran out. Dave didn't consider it too alarming since he was going up now and needed to vent some out anyway. He just didn't realize he had used so much. So he hooked up one of the extra tanks he was carrying to supply air to his buoyancy vest and continued descending. He did his decompression stops on the way up, and about halfway through, someone set down hot soup for him. It was in a squeezy bottle to drink it, so he would go off his rebreather and onto open circuit in a tank. He would take a breath and then take the regulator out of his mouth, suck out some soup, and then blow air into the soup bottle before removing it from his mouth to counteract the suction. Then he would put his regulator back into his mouth so he could breathe again, and he just did that repeatedly until he drank all the soup. His total dive time was 6 hours and 40 minutes, almost an hour longer than he originally planned. Other things of note for the dive: either the P-valve for his external catheter blocked up, or the pressure from the water in his dry suit prevented him from being able to go most of the dive, to the point where the pressure started to make the catheter peel off. Considering it's glued on, I'll leave the description at that. But Dave's dive broke the world record for diving the deepest solo cave dive on a rebreather, and it was the deepest cave dive on a rebreather, period. Like, not even a buddy team or a group of people had tried to take a rebreather that deep before. And it's here that I should note that at this point in time, all rebreathers had a maximum proven depth of 328 feet. For the Inspiration brand rebreather that Dave was using, the manual for it said as much, and that after that depth, the onboard decompression was invalid and carbon dioxide endurance was unknown. After 426 feet, the depth gauge is inaccurate, and after 524 feet, the structural integrity is unknown, and the buzzer will implode. The buzzer indicates to divers a number of urgent errors, like high or low oxygen levels, and important things like that. The day after the dive was a rest day for Dave, and the day after that, Dawn and Dave planned to do the dive again. There was still a lot of gas tanks in place, and Dawn couldn't resist the urge to see what all was down there, considering he owned the place. They brought a few additional tanks to place and some to keep on them, but for the most part, they felt that there were enough tanks in the cave for the both of them already. On the day of the dive, during the descent, they were moving a minute behind Dave's previous schedule. At some point on the way down, Dave's mask started leaking, so he tried to fix it the best he could and just continued diving. He was mostly focused on his diluent. He didn't want to run out on his way down like he did previously. So at just over halfway down, Dave reconfigured his gas setup to make sure he wouldn't run out of diluent. And at just a handful of feet away from the record-setting spot he made it to before, there was a thump. The electronics on his rebreather started acting up, his main control panel died, and his backup was flashing on and off. This startled Dave, so he flashed his light at Dawn, didn't bother waiting for a response, and turned to ascend. Going back up the angled tunnel, he tried to troubleshoot. He turned the control panels that died off and on until it came back on, and the backup stopped flashing on its own. He was trying to decide if he had to switch to open circuit or semi-closed, but with everything on again, he didn't have to. Although on the way up, he could hear a constant electrical sound. It sounded like a distant sonar. Dave could tell that it was coming from behind his head, and it sounded really faint. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell it wasn't good. He figured his system was now on a clock because everything was probably being fried and wouldn't last much longer. He made it to his first decompression stop, which was within reach of some of the bailout tanks they left. During that stop, Dawn caught up to him. They went on to the second decompression stop, still over halfway down, and while he was there, both of his controls started flashing on and off. Oxygen injection stopped, and the indicator telling him how much oxygen was in his gas mixture stopped too. At this point, he decided to switch over to a semi-closed circuit and showed Dawn what was going on. Dawn was shocked and told him to switch over to semi-closed too, so Dave mentally ran through what he had to do, since he could do everything manually now for the next 3 hours or use the bailout tanks. Dave chose to manually control it, so every 4 breaths, he had to dump the air out of his mask through his nose and then manually add oxygen. It was going okay until he reached the narrow restriction going into the main shaft. He removed his tanks to get through there and got tangled. He exhaled so he could inject gas when he realized he couldn't reach the button to inject oxygen into his rebreather. It got twisted around and he couldn't find it, so he decided he would switch to open circuit. He started getting pretty desperate to breathe in, but in the process of switching over, he couldn't find the regulator and accidentally swallowed a little water. Immediately, he thought it was over for him, but he was so calm about it that it kind of clarified his thinking, and he was able to get the regulator and sort out everything else. Once he got a few calming breaths in, realizing he almost drowned, he then realized he literally just swam past a tank that he dropped at the beginning of his dive and could have easily gone back just a couple of feet to use until he got everything else sorted out. He had just completely forgotten about it while he was calmly panicking. In his notes, he says he was calm through the entire thing, and outwardly I'm sure he was, since that is what they are trained to do. Keep calm, work through the problem, and under zero circumstances are you to ever give up. But internally, there's no way his brain wasn't moving a mile a minute, especially after swallowing water. But Dave went through over 2 hours more of decompression stops after that, keeping in mind that he had left Dawn way back at 280 feet, so he was behind Dave and would need bailouts himself. When Dave left the water, he had immediate pain in his shoulder from decompression sickness. Dave was bent, so he ended up doing at least 2.5 hours of in-water recompression with oxygen. After that, he got out of the water again, and the pain was gone. So he went to bed breathing oxygen, but over the next hour, the pain came back. So Dawn drove Dave 3 hours to the nearest recompression chamber. Dave had 3 treatments in the chamber over the next 3 days. After inspecting his equipment, Dave realized that the sound he heard when diving was his buzzer imploding, causing him to not have a high oxygen warning alert. Allegedly, it's also when he realized the warnings and depth restrictions that came with the Inspiration rebreather. So Dave eventually went and bought a Biomarine Mark 15.5 rebreather. It was built for the US Navy, but sold secondhand, and Dave modified it in a way he believed would allow him to use it at deeper depths than what was recommended. On May 29, 2004, Dave took another trip to South Africa. For 2 weeks prior, he had been sending diving gear to the airport through some of his friends that were pilots. They would store his gear at the crew hotel, and he needed all of his gear because he had a major dive in mind. When Dave landed on the 30th, the people he rented cars from to take to his dive trips would pick up his gear from the hotel and bring it to him. He then traveled from the Johannesburg airport to Badgat, 186 miles away. He made it there around 11 a.m. and immediately started setting up his dive gear. He was in the water by 3:20 that afternoon to do an almost hour-long dive to just under 80 feet. It was the first time he had used his new rebreather with a dry suit, and it's speculated that it was his first time diving since the accident the year before. The next day, he did another dive to 217 feet or 66 meters, and it lasted for about 2.5 hours. After the dive, he realized he was a bit wet on one spot and realized his dry suit had a small hole he would need to fix. Dave figured he made the hole when he tried to squeeze through a tight spot earlier that day. Nevertheless, he patched the hole that evening and figured a test dive the next day would show if it was fixed or not. Tuesday morning, Dave did a 2-hour dive to 344 feet. His dry suit was dry at the end, so his patch job held up, but really he was mostly focused on getting comfortable with the new configurations he put on his rebreather. He replaced the original analog system and had done several dives with that system, but that was his first with oil in the handset. On his test dives, the unit worked fine, but the depth reading was off by 30%, so if Dave was at 344 feet, it would show 253. That wasn't a big deal for Dave, considering he really only used that system to control the rebreather. It just meant he couldn't use the decompression calculations on it since the depth reading was wrong. But that's why he had 2 dive computers to do that instead. The next day, Dave did a short test dive to practice using an underwater scooter to dive. Those are battery-powered propellers that pull people through the water. You just grab onto the handles and then use your body to steer. It does all the work. You can use them in pools, on the beach, snorkeling, and especially diving. The way people move through the water with them reminds me of Superman with his arms in front of him, flying through the air, but with the ease of Aquaman underwater. The true goal for this trip to South Africa was for Dave to try to dive in Bushman's cave. So, while packing for the planned trip to visit Bushman's cave, Dave and Dawn filled 15 12-liter air tanks filled with different gas mixtures, along with several other large tanks for extra gas, and gathered all of the diving and camping equipment they would need. They were also planning to meet with reef divers, one named Peter Herbst, who was actually well known and the owner of Reef Divers and a chief instructor. He's very experienced and oversees all instructional activities and has been an active director for fun since 2004. But he actually started teaching scuba diving in 1994. There were a few others to help oversee the dive and help bring all of their equipment. It took quite a bit of packing and repacking before they managed to get everything to fit in the vehicles they were bringing. Then they drove over 600 miles to Bushman's Cave. They made it to the campsite by Bushman's at 3 p.m. that Friday and slept in the tents in the cold that night. The next morning, they had to hike all of their gear down the cliff leading to the sinkhole and prepared to do their first dive after lunch. They knew they needed to set up 10 bailout tanks for Dave's dive, but they didn't know if there were guidelines in place already that they could use. Once they got in the water, they realized that the old lines used by a couple of divers who broke world records there were in place, but that the loops to attach Dave's tanks to were at the wrong depths, so they decided to stick to placing their own lines. They planned for the next day to be focused on placing Dave's tanks deeper in Bushman's and laying line. Deon and another diver would dive together too. They originally wanted to dive the first day they got there, but since they made it too late and then had to move everything down the hill on top of that, they just had to adjust their schedule and plan so that Dave could have a rest day before the big dive and a rest day after too. Over the next couple of days, the tanks were placed. They had to fix the motors on the dive scooters since they would stop working after 5 minutes. They had one of the 2 or 3 other support divers also go and pick up items they forgot to bring when he was arriving on Sunday. On Monday, Dave rested and some of his support divers dove, and that night they planned the details of the big dive the next day. They wanted to start the dive as early as possible so any problems could be solved during daylight hours. So Dave would wake up at 4 a.m. and be in the water by 5:30 at the latest. The dive was estimated to take 7 hours. Deon would meet him at 394 feet or 120 meters on his way back up. Another diver would meet him at 45 minutes into the dive, and someone else would meet him an hour and 15 minutes in. They discussed what to do if things went wrong or not as planned, and who and how food and drinks would be given to Dave. On Tuesday morning, Dave started his dive just after 6 a.m. On his way down, he thought about how everyone was on inspiration rebreathers, except for him. Even the spare was inspiration. After he passed the last bailout tank on his way down, he wondered if his equipment would hold up so deep. He hadn't taken it further than where he put the last bailout tank at 394 feet. He felt like his modified Mark 15.5 rebreather would hold up, but wasn't as confident in the hammerhead handset that came with it. He felt like it wouldn't be too hard to switch to manual though, so that was always an option if it came to it. He started injecting gas into his suit after hitting 600 feet to slow his descent, but it didn't do much, even after 30 seconds of injecting the air. He injected argon, and that stopped his descent at 699 feet, or 213 meters deep. His handsets were showing incorrect depth readings by a lot, but his 2 dive computers were still reading accurately, so he relied on them. Dave's vision started to tunnel a bit past where he first tried to inject air to slow down, and by this point, it was significantly worse. He was a little upset he didn't stop lower and considered descending more to reach a deeper goal, but decided he didn't want to waste gas on doing that. He was only 10 minutes into the dive at this point, so he looked around where he was at. His dive computer said the time it would take to get to the surface was 6.5 hours. Dave thought about where his decompression stops would be at relative to the bailout tanks and started ascending. He made it to the meeting point where he was to meet Deon a few minutes early, so he watched him come down. The rest of the dive was alright, small inconveniences here or there, and the total dive time ended up being 8.5 hours. Dave was more cautious this time leaving the water. He stayed in the water breathing oxygen for a while before sitting beside the pool for a few hours and then hiking up to the campsite. The next day, the group explored a dry cave nearby, and the day after that, Dave and Deon did what was supposed to be a 40-minute scooter dive to 262 feet. It ended up being over 2.5 hours. They laid more line and removed the tanks they previously left, but at some point, Deon's line reel handle got caught on the scooter propeller he was using, and so it shot off into the abyss. They both ended up having to use Dave's scooter to make it back to the surface. The next day, they drove back to Johannesburg, and the day after that, Deon piloted a plane back to Hong Kong. In October of 2004, Dave returned to Bushman's Hole. He hadn't dove for 4 months, but he came back to support a diver named Verna. She was trying to set the record for the deepest dive by a woman. She went to 725 feet, or 221 meters, successfully. Dave acted as her deep support diver at just under 500 feet. After that, Dave took a 2-day break from diving before doing a deep dive himself. The Extreme Dream Team was there to support the dive, and Deon was going to be Dave's deep support diver. There were a few hiccups the morning of the dive, but they worked them out in time for Dave to start his dive on time. He was using his modified rebreather, which at this point he clarifies that he took out the analog electronics and replaced them with hammerhead digital electronics. He filled the electronics with medical-grade paraffin to stop it from imploding when he dove deeper than recommended. Dave started his dive and thought about how it was a hard dive to plan because he wasn't sure how deep it was to reach the bottom, and he didn't know if the shot line that was set made it all the way down to the bottom. He was worried about descending too quickly and sliding off the line at the end, or possibly getting tangled in the line at the bottom if it was too long and just sitting in a pile. After hitting 787 feet, or 240 meters, Dave knew he had to start looking down at what was below him. He had to be careful not to hit the bottom and sink into the silt. He was too deep to really rely on his dive computers since none of them would be reliable at that depth. Instead, before he started to dive, he ran different calculations on the computer and brought generated tables with him. He continued going deeper, and even though one of his dive computers had completely failed, the other was still on, so Dave continued exploring. He made it to 886 feet, or 227 meters, and could see the floor of the cave about 30 feet below him. While he was scanning the floor with his light, he saw a body. Dave immediately knew who it was. It was Deon Dreyer. He had died on December 17th, 1994, and had never been found, even after extensive searches for his remains. Deon was lying on his back with his arms in the air and his legs spread out, and seeing this didn't shock Deon at all. Instead, seeing Deon caused him to try to quickly think about what he should do next. Should he continue diving to increase his depth record, or should he go check out the remains? It was an easy choice for Dave. He swam down to Deon and tried to get his remains so that he could bring them back to the surface. But time was of the essence because the longer he fiddled with Deon, the longer the dive would be, and the more air he would burn through. He tried to lift Deon a few times, but it was so difficult, Dave started huffing and panting from exertion. Heavy breathing like that during a dive is incredibly dangerous, especially diving that deep in the water. And Dave realized that he was now 1 minute over the maximum amount of time he could spend at the bottom. Every single minute at that depth adds an hour onto decompression time. Since time was of the essence, he tied his line to Deon's remains so that he could be found again. He didn't even bother to cut the reel free before he turned and started ascending back to the surface. Dave started mentally calculating his ascent rate and where he would need to do his decompression stops. There were plenty of bailout tanks from Verna's world record that was set a few days before, so Dave used those while he continued on to meet Deon. Once Deon saw he was okay, he went down to retrieve the tanks Dave just left and then met back up with him on the way up. Dave wrote on a slate that he found a body, and he also wrote the depth that he found it at. It kind of took Deon by surprise, but they both shook hands and Deon continued ascending. Dave went through the rest of his decompression stops and exited the water 9 hours and 40 minutes after he entered it. He laid on the ground by the pool for a few hours to calm down and adjust before hiking back up the hill to catch a ride to the farmhouse he was staying at. While he was resting, he noticed an ache in his left forearm, and he originally believed that it was because his dive computer was too tight around his wrist. But after he did some oxygen therapy and tried to sleep on it, it still hurt the next morning, so he decided to go to a decompression chamber for treatment. After a couple of hours, the pain went away, and the news quickly spread through the media about not only him setting a world record for depth, but that Deon Dreyer's body had been found. Now, Dave's wife, Anne, had no clue of how extreme Dave's diving was until she heard about that trip. She wasn't a fan of it, but she also knew she couldn't ask him to stop. The best thing she knew how to do was support Dave on his adventure, so that's what she did. When she heard about him wanting to retrieve Deon's remains, she came up with the idea of a body bag and helped construct it. Dave and Deon started planning for the logistics of the recovery operation because one of this magnitude needed a lot of help. And they also reached out to Deon's family about it. Deon was born in August of 1974 and was a recreational scuba diver from South Africa. His father's name is Theo, and he owned his own business that sells two-way radios. Deon's mother, Marie, raised him in a town about 30 miles south of Johannesburg. Deon was known to have a passion for diving and loving to do things like hunt, race cars, motorcycles, and design ridiculously loud car radios. Deon, at 20 years old, had done about 200 dives when divers with the South Africa Cave Diving Association invited him to join them for a dive at Bushman's Hole. It was during Christmas break in 1994, and they planned to go down to 492 feet or 150 meters. Deon was going to be a support diver for Nuno Gomes, the diver I mentioned setting a world record before, and he was super excited to do it. The team was preparing for Nuno's dive attempt later that week, so they were doing a practice dive. On their way back up from the dive, they were at about 160 feet when the dive leader did a quick head count and noticed someone was missing. He swam down a bit to see if he could find whoever he missed, and he saw a light sinking below him. He started trying to chase the diver to try and catch up with him, but he was sinking faster than the dive leader was able to swim. The distance was becoming too great, and it was pretty clear that chasing the diver down would endanger and most likely kill the dive leader, so then 2 divers would be lost instead of 1. And unfortunately, the dive leader just had to leave Deon to whatever would come of him. About 2 weeks after he died, his father hired a mining company to use a small remote-operated sub to find Deon. The only thing they found was his dive helmet on the floor of the sinkhole, but they couldn't find any trace of his remains. His parents put a plaque on a rock wall above the entry pool to Bushman's Hole in memory of their son, and it made a huge impression on the cave diving community because the remains of most other divers are usually recovered, but because of how deep Deon was believed to be in Bushman's, everyone was kind of continuously reminded by the plaque that his remains were in the cave anytime they dove there. Something that lingered with Deon's father was that 2 weeks before that dive expedition, Deon's grandfather died. Their entire family was sitting around a barbecue one night, and Deon kind of joked that if he had a choice on how he would go out in life, he wanted to go out diving, which is not a completely uncommon sentiment among divers in these kinds of stories. Nuno Gomes would go on to break the world record for the deepest cave dive in Bushman's Cave in 1996, so 2 years after Deon's passing. He made it to 927 feet, or 283 meters, on an open circuit and has broken many other records since. According to who you ask, he's seen as one of the best divers ever, or an adrenaline junkie. Now, once Dave told Deon's parents about his discovery, they were excited at the idea of being able to bury their son. They didn't want anyone risking their lives or getting hurt, but they couldn't help but hold out hope and feel confident in Dave's confidence in himself. A team was put together and a documentary crew followed the entire process. In January 2005, they went out to Bushman's Hole. Dawn and Peter were on the support dive team. Practice dives took place and logistics were worked out. Leading up to this point, Dave and Dawn would regularly tell other divers to always look out for themselves first and not to endanger themselves trying to help someone else. There was an air of timid confidence among everyone, like everyone felt like everything would be fine because it had been up to that point, but also like they were kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And to be fair, Dave and Dawn had practiced the recovery at Kamadi Springs, where Dave had to recover Dawn as though he was Deon. Now, in the past, if there was video recordings of dives, someone else would record and take photos. But this time, a documentary photographer asked Dave to wear the camera on his helmet. Dave agreed, and on January 8th, Dave entered Bushman's Hole and dove down to Deon's remains. It took him about 10 minutes to get there, and he had to take some time to pull Deon's air tanks out of the mud. Once he did that, Deon's remains started to float, which this was completely unexpected because they had been told by forensic experts that Deon would have been composed of only skeletal remains. It had been over 10 years at this point, so he was expected to be completely decomposed. Since Deon started floating, Dave had to try and pull him down into the body bag rather than easily lift and place him inside instead. This took longer than he would have planned for it to, so he put down his light so he could use 2 hands to push Deon into the body bag. At the same time, Dawn was waiting for Dave to send up Deon's body, and it was getting past the time he was supposed to wait. He started his dive 13 minutes after Dave, and they were supposed to meet at 722 feet when Dave was on his way up. And that was actually the deepest Deon had ever dove to. But Deon started getting nervous. He could feel that something was wrong, and he didn't see any bubbles coming up from below. Rebreathers give off a small amount of air when ascending, so Deon would have seen a few bubbles. Like I said before, everyone had multiple talks about not risking their lives unnecessarily, and Dave told Deon not to come help him unless he signaled for help. Dave didn't signal for help, but Deon knew something was wrong, so he swam down from where he was positioned to check on Dave. Now, normally Dave would have put his light around his neck instead of putting it down, but because the camera was on top of his helmet, he wasn't able to do that. When he put the light down, the cable connected to the light, the dive line, and the line connected to Deon's bag all got tangled up. Dave tried to untangle the line reel and even got out something to cut the line, but he didn't cut it. Dave started breathing heavier and increasingly more sporadic while trying to untangle everything until he stopped breathing. Deon had made it closer at this point and saw that Dave's light wasn't moving. He was now at 820 feet or 250 meters, and well beyond the inspiration rebreather's limits. Deon's hammerhead rebreather console imploded, and he now had to manually control the oxygen flow. As much as it shocked and pained him to do it, he was forced to turn and leave Dave with Deon at the bottom of Bushman's hole. Deon ascended up and manually injected oxygen into his rebreather loop, but he put too much. He had to switch over to one of his bailout tanks quickly. As he continued to ascend, he realized one of his dive computers flooded. But once he got a little bit higher, he was able to switch back to his rebreather. He still had to manually inject the oxygen though. He could see 2 divers above him, but they left before he got there because he was running late. When the 2 divers left, they could see that there was only 1 light below them instead of 2. And immediately they looked to each other and realized that something had happened. They didn't know who was there and who had been left behind, but they knew something went terribly wrong. So they left their post because it was time for them to leave anyway and ascended to the next diver and passed them a note. It basically said that they could only see 1 light below and they weren't sure which D it was, Deon or Dave. As the information passed from diver to diver and to the surface, everyone on the surface was shocked to hear that someone had died. They had just literally been talking about how the hard part was over, how Dave had gotten Deon and was on his way back up, and probably met with the other support divers already. And then they heard this news. Immediately, Verna, who was running the show from the surface, who was the woman who, just a couple days prior to this, set the record for the deepest cave dive for a woman, the deepest altitude dive, and set an African record for women. Now, she was overseeing everything and making sure divers were where they needed to be, everyone had what they needed, and sending backup divers in as required. And she was on it. She had a backup diver in the water to figure out what was going on. She had a diver go down to check on whoever was the only person who came up from the bottom, and they discovered it was Deon. Deon passed the diver a slate where he was able to write Dave not coming back. At first they thought it was Deon and not Dave, since most of the people there were friends of Deon. They were more than a little relieved to hear Deon was okay though, at least for now. As messed up as that might sound, I do understand the thought process. A diver brought Deon a spare dive computer in response to another message he sent. But now the race was on to make sure Deon would survive the dive because everyone's calculations had been pre-planned. The dive computers were clearly not totally reliable at the depth Dave and Deon were at, and Deon swimming down closer to Dave threw things off even more. Deon passed the slate with reworked decompression calculations to a safety diver, and everyone on the surface started reworking calculations to figure out where Deon needed to have decompression stops, for how long, if someone needed to take air to him, and other things like that. At 151 feet, Deon thought he was okay. A diver had just left him, and he suddenly felt lightheaded. He had forgotten to add oxygen to the loop, so he switched to his bailout tank and immediately was dizzy. Deon was bent and suffering from vertigo, specifically inner ear decompression sickness. He lost his grip on the line and spun around in circles, out of control. He kept vomiting and barely managed to grab onto the line when he felt like it was passing him. He held on for dear life and took a minute to check his dive computer. He was higher up than he should have been, so he swam back down. He had to stay on the bailout tank since he couldn't manually control the rebreather in the shape he was in. At some point, a safety diver found him, and Deon passed him a message that had everyone ensure someone was with Deon the rest of the way up. They weren't willing to lose another diver to a body recovery. The process was brutal for Deon. The safety divers essentially took over everything for him. He was vomiting, dry heaving, and nearly losing consciousness. The safety divers were the ones moving him through the water because every time he moved to the next stop, he would dry heave uncontrollably. And honestly, the divers going in and out of the water were all a bit bent. Like, no one was really in the best of shape to be going in and out of the water, but no one was willing to give up. At one point, Deon thought he changed to a tank of 50% oxygen, but he had actually grabbed a bailout tank with only 4% oxygen. That was way too low of an amount of oxygen, and had he breathed it in, he would have been out in just a handful of minutes. Luckily, the diver with him caught it in time and made sure he was on the right tank. Getting closer to the surface, a pain shot through his left knee, so brutal that they pushed him to skip his last decompression stop. He was so close to losing consciousness that the other divers knew he wouldn't survive if he did. They pulled Deon out of the water and hauled him up the hill for 24 minutes before getting him into the on-site recompression chamber that they had. He was in there for 8 hours before being released. He was still very dizzy, his head tilted to the left and his eyes crossed. Deon did 2 more treatments on Sunday, a few more on Monday, and on Tuesday. He was improving, but he still couldn't walk without help. Deon spent the next few months undergoing many chamber treatments and never completely recovered. While he was going through those treatments on site, everyone else was there still planning to do another dive into Bushman's hole to get the rest of the air tanks out. Peter stayed behind with police divers to help get out all the equipment. The police divers were on site pretty much the entire time to oversee the initial recovery of Deon's body, but they were only trained to go down to 66 feet or 20 meters. Deon suggested that Peter attach a lift bag to the line further down so that the tanks towards the bottom could be lifted out. It was an okay idea, but it did make Peter nervous because when he had tried to remove some of the tanks earlier, he got tangled in the line and couldn't get out. He had to struggle to ascend high enough to where the police divers could spot him and come help free him. On Wednesday, Peter and another diver went down to over 300 feet deep to collect tanks above that point and to attach a lift bag at that point. That was significantly deeper than Peter and the other diver had ever gone before. While the tanks floated up to the police divers stationed higher, they saw a braided white line hanging down. No one knew where it came from, but while they were getting out of the water, one of the police divers went to Peter and told him that they saw them. Peter asked him what he was saying. What did he mean he saw who? And the police diver responded that they saw Dave, and it looked like someone else was underneath him, floating against the roof. It turns out that lifting the shot line was enough to free the remains from the silt at the bottom and lift them to the top of the cave. Somehow, Peter and the other diver with him didn't spot them floating past them while they were collecting tanks. But to be fair, it's pitch black in this cave. I mean, they can see their lights shining on the shot line, which is just pretty much one line going from the entrance all the way to the bottom of the cave. It's not branching out anywhere else. It's just way too dark. So like if they lose the shot line, if they take their eyes off of what's directly in front of them, they will be lost. They're in the abyss, so them not seeing the bodies is completely understandable. They had to wait a while after diving for their bodies to acclimate before getting back into the water again. When they did, they saw the line was wrapped twice around the top of Dave's light that hung at his side. The line was the reel that Dave attached to Deon when he first found him in October. So basically, Dave was caught in the old line that he left, instead of attaching a new line to Deon's equipment and just hauling him up instead. The realization was a lot for Peter to come to terms with, so he had to swim away, and the other diver that was with him attached a lift bag to the remains and cut away the line. The other diver took Dave's remains to the police diver, and Peter took Deon's remains to the surface. It was at that point they realized Deon was not a skeleton. His body was deprived of oxygen in the water, but without any organisms to feed on his remains, he had essentially just turned into soap. He was complete minus his head, which fell off before Dave found him. There was still air in Dave's tanks, and his rebreather was still in his mouth. But right there at the dive site, they made a copy of the camera recording and watched it. At 0 minutes and 0 seconds, Dave entered the water. By 11.5 minutes, Dave made it to the bottom and followed the line to Deon's remains. At 12.5 minutes, Dave made it to Deon and pulled out the body bag. Less than a minute after that, Dave tried to push the bag over Deon's legs and started breathing a bit heavier. Deon started floating free from the silt, and Dave started working to pull the bag over his body. His breathing started picking up, and he tried to force Deon into the bag. At this point, he could have just left and the body would have started floating up, and it would have been super easy to just haul it with him. But at 14.5 minutes, the line got caught on Dave's light, and his breathing got heavier. He managed to clear the line and tried to open a pair of shears or scissors, but he was already struggling because he was suffering from nitrogen narcosis, and now that he was breathing quickly, carbon dioxide was affecting him too. His hands were fumbling and struggling to do what he needed them to do, and by 15 minutes in, he put his hand on Deon's skull, but it doesn't seem like he noticed. At that point, he only had 75 seconds before he had to leave the bottom. So he moved to leave, but realized he was caught on the line. He tried to entangle himself and then cut the line, but his breathing was getting very hard and very rapid. Now, approaching 17 minutes into his dive, he was now 1 minute over time. He tried to move the shot line and drag the body with him, but his breathing had turned rapid and shallow. At 20 minutes and 41 seconds into the dive, Dave's breathing got choked up, and then it stopped. Dawn would see his unmoving light about 2 or 3 minutes after that. So had he proceeded down to Dave, he would have died for nothing. That was Dave's 333rd dive. Just before Dave died, he was taking 36 breaths per minute, which honestly, trying to do that on land with nothing else going on is tough. Under pressure, nitrogen narcosis, and probably unaware of just how bad of a position he was in, since he would have been out of it a bit, I can't imagine a world where that combination would have ended any other way than what it did. It was widely believed that Deon had died from carbon dioxide poisoning, which you get when you're at depth and exerting yourself too much and breathing too rapidly, which would essentially be the same thing that took Dave too. His rebreather didn't fail, but it is alleged that Dave didn't receive any instruction or training on the Mark 15.5, and he did less than 50 dives with it before his death. Someone did suggest that the method of packing Dave used on his rebreather made it much harder to breathe, which led to problems that would have taken a good amount of time and effort to resolve. Now, before I get into why I believe that this particular incident wasn't completely out of right field, I do want to address specifically what happened in this case. Dave apparently did not dive with a helmet on. That wasn't something he usually did, and adding a camera on top of that was also completely out of character for him to use on a dive. He agreed to put the camera on the helmet on his head because he was asked to, and I'm sure he didn't think much of it. Again, he did say he was going to just have to reconfigure how he used his light. But Dawn would later come out and say, had he heard that Dave agreed to do that, and that was the discussion, he would have chimed in and shut it down immediately. Because on top of everything else going on, switching up something as routine and as vital as placement of lighting completely threw him off. So had Dave maybe not had to worry about the camera on his helmet and just wrap the light around his neck like he usually did, things could have possibly turned out different this time, but I don't think he would have been cleared of something going wrong in the future. Now, looking at Dave's history, it's not difficult to see how this would have happened. He did his open water diving course on holiday, and later the same year he returned to do nitrox courses, which is a type of gas that divers breathe. By his 23rd dive, he was reaching depths greater than 100 feet or 33 meters, which according to a diver's analysis on this topic, and a few divers I've spoken to, is kind of an irresponsible escalation. For reference, you typically won't see too many responsible divers going 100 plus feet down earlier than their 100 or so dive. In this case, the guy said he didn't reach that depth until his 159th dive, and that the twin configuration with the bailout tanks was something that he hadn't done until his 400 plus dive, which was something Dave started doing early on. Like even on a shallow dive, using twins is not something a new diver should do. And about 2 months after that, Dave was back and did 8 dives in 3 days, one of which he was buddied with 2 divers who stopped 30 plus feet above where he chose to go. And again, this is with him having less than 30 dives under his belt. On that same trip, he did 2 dives to around 175 feet or 52 meters, which is something that the diver in this article says he didn't reach until his 360th dive. And Dave was back diving 3 weeks after that, doing a course where he dove into sunken ships. So Dave would have huge gaps of time between his dive trips, and pretty much all of his diving was done in clear tropical ocean water or calm waves. In 2000, Dave did 6 dives in the Philippines. At one point, he did 4 dives in 3 days, ranging from 160 to 200 feet or 61 meters. So on at least one of the days, he did a double dive over 167 feet, and that is super dangerous. It also marked his 62nd dive, most of which again were training dives. After that, he went to Florida and did 21 dives in 10 days as part of a diving course. Dave's 85th dive was in a cave in Peacock Springs, and he swam a distance of just under 3,000 feet or 900 meters. For the year and a half after that, Dave traveled to Florida twice and averaged at least 2 dives a day. Then he took a few more trips to the Philippines, where he did a trimix course, which is gas mixture that divers use, and he dove to over 300 feet deep. It was after that he went to South Africa and met Don Shirley in 2002. He wanted to look into and be examined for additional cave dive training and rebreather training. He was on dive 180 at that point. 60% of those were training dives. After that, he took a month and a half off before traveling to Florida to do 18 dives. Then in November of that year, he went back to South Africa for work and spent 1 day diving, where he did a dive to 60 feet and then the second one to over 160 feet. Then he piloted a plane back home. It's usually advised to do deeper dives first and not consecutively, although apparently the minimum surface interval time between dives should be at least 10 minutes. But if it's less than 10 minutes, then the second dive is considered to be a continuation of the first. Of course, there's fine print to that though. Like, repetitive dives should be to less than 100 feet or 30 meters, and with the appropriate amount of downtime in between. He would do a lot of diving in short bursts and do a lot of repetitive deep dives close together before piloting a plane home. Now, repetitive diving, not even necessarily deep diving, but just a lot of diving back to back, increases risk of decompression stress. But flying after diving also significantly increases that too, because the pressure in the plane is lower than the atmospheric pressure on the ground. So what is suggested is that after a single dive that doesn't require any decompression stops, is you should wait at least 12 hours before flying. If you've done multiple dives in 1 day or several days of diving, then it's suggested that you wait at least 18 hours before getting on a plane. After any dive requiring a decompression stop, it's strongly recommended that you wait, and I quote, substantially longer than 24 hours, as that is considered prudent, end quote. In December of 2002 and January of the following year, Dave traveled to a place where he did a rebreather course and did 26 dives as part of that training. That's around the same time that he bought the Inspiration rebreather. In March of 2003, he traveled to Mexico to dive in a type of sinkhole where he did 17 dives in 1 week, although this was apparently very easy diving. Then he took 5 weeks off from diving, which brings us to April 2003, where he dived almost exclusively at Kamati Springs over 11 trips. Dave did his first rebreather dive after taking a course on it, and it was his first dive in a dry suit with the rebreather. It was his first time diving alone with the rebreather, and it was his first time in a cave with the rebreather. It was also his first deep dive in a cave, period. His rebreather actually went off indicating high oxygen levels during that dive where he had like a million firsts going on at the same time, and he chose to keep going. He went pretty deep and was shocked that he did not have enough bailout gas if the rebreather decided to fail. In May, June, and July following that, Dave did 4 dives solo to over 200 feet deep, and then he did 1 with Dawn to the same depth. That was his first dive with Dawn and his 262nd dive, period. Then in August, Dawn decided he wanted to explore where some of the mine shafts in Kamati Springs led, so he put together a group of 6 divers that included Dave. There were several gear failures with Dave's equipment before he even got into the water on their first day trying to explore, and then the next day, Dawn had a gear failure and had to stop before they even got to the shaft in Kamati Springs. Dave and 1 other diver continued on though, and went to over 480 feet deep, and when they surfaced again, the other diver was complaining about shoulder and elbow pain. Turns out he was bent and he needed to be put in a recompression chamber. 2 days after that, Dawn and Dave dove pretty deep into a different section of the mine. 2 months after that is where I started Dave's story. So we can very easily see how what happened. The inspiration rebreather in particular only being out for 2 years when Dave got a hold of one. And in the 2 years since their release, only 1,000 had been sold and 8 divers had died while using them. By 2003, 15 had died. And it wasn't the fault of the rebreather completely, like I'm sure there were cases here and there maybe of gear failure, but the reason that such a high number of divers were dying using the rebreather was because people were incorrectly setting up and maintaining their equipment, on top of the amount of people who should not have been allowed to deep dive due to their lack of experience. According to a book on Dave's life and this event, closed-circuit rebreathers allowed divers to reach depths and enjoy extended run times that were well beyond their abilities and experience. The rebreathers worked too well because they made people overconfident, whereas open-circuit forced divers to be prudent. In my opinion, this was a sad but important story of the dangers of pushing beyond limits and diving and in life. Diving should be viewed as technical diving regardless of if it's scuba diving by a reef or hundreds of feet down in a cave. That's a hobby that requires precise operation and constant monitoring, and not something that just anybody should feel confident that they can do anything with. And I think it also is a huge reminder of how personal goals, ambition, and determination can become dangerous. I could see in the documentary how determined Dave was to get Deon's body, and being so motivated while also being someone who is very clearly and regularly disregarding the rules was a dangerous combination. Ambition is good, but it has to be balanced with a healthy dose of respect for boundaries and knowing when to stop, even if it means a goal is left unfulfilled, because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about Dave's safety, but also all of the lives he put in danger with his goal. And let's not forget the piloting after diving. I know a lot of rules in diving are kind of like, well, we don't really know exactly why we shouldn't do it. It's just we were told by our instructor we shouldn't. And so sometimes it's blown off. But to me, this story wasn't just an if, but a when and with who. Who would be caught in the wave of Dave's ambition? Both Dawn and Peter are well known in the diving community and had significantly more experience than Dave. And yet, they still were both put in extremely dangerous positions in pursuit of his goal. I know like 95% of you guys listening are thinking, well, I don't have to worry about that. But I think this is a lesson that can be transferred to so many different things. And I always say hindsight is 20/20, but the unfortunate bright spot to the stories that I tell are that the hindsight is now directly in your face. So just keep it in mind. Stay safe, and I'll be back soon. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.